Hello, welcome to Lecture 14 on Early Christianity. We are ending our section on the Bible, and we are moving into the next section, which is on church history. And so this lecture is going to cover just the early centuries of Christianity. And one of the first things we need to talk about is how Christianity split from Judaism, because the Christian movement, the Jesus movement, if we want to call it that, started within Judaism. So all of the very first Christians were Jews, and most of the Christians in the first century ended up coming from a Jewish background. But at some point, Christianity was not just a sect or a section of Judaism. It became something that was kind of on its own. And so we're going to talk about some of the factors involved in Christianity sort of breaking from the Jewish faith. So up until the fall of the temple in 70 AD or 70 CE, when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, Christianity was accepted as a movement within Judaism, and that was a good thing because Judaism was legally accepted in the Roman Empire. So it was just thought of as another small group that is part of the overall faith of Judaism. However, if you remember when we talked about Acts, there was a Jerusalem council or conference. It's called two different things, Apostolic Council or the Jerusalem Conference. And at that point, the early Christians decided to make it possible for Gentiles to become Christians without becoming Jews. And that was sort of the beginning of the end of Christianity being a movement within Judaism, because many Jewish people did not like that idea, that they would have to sit down at a table and eat with people who were eating pork, who did not follow the dietary laws of Judaism. And so that was really the first thing that happened. But once the temple fell in 70 AD, there were many, many tensions after that. The Jews met at a place called Jamnia, so it was like the Council of Jamnia, and they had to figure out how are we going to move forward as a Jewish faith without our temple, because the temple was a huge part of the Jewish faith. And so what they did was they restructured Judaism. The Sadducees were kind of defunct now because they were in charge of the temple, and now there was no temple. And so what they did was follow the model of the Pharisees. Pharisaic Judaism focused on the law, the Torah, and so at Jamnia they decided, okay, we're going to focus on the law now that we don't have the temple. So really, Judaism becomes a Pharisaic Judaism at this point. The other thing that they did at Jamnia was really make a statement against Christians. Now, they didn't name Christians in the statement, but they basically talked about heretics, people that they would not accept as Jewish, and the characteristics of Christians fell within that. So there was much less tolerance of Christians within Judaism after the Council of Jamnia. And so what happened after that was that Christianity all of a sudden was not legal anymore in the Roman Empire. If Christianity was not part of Judaism, then they were not going to be legal. And so this is when a lot of the persecution started. Now, there was persecution of Jews all throughout the first century as well, but it doesn't get as violent for Christians until after they split from Judaism. And there's no one date that we can point to say this is when this happened. It happened over a long period of time throughout the first century. The thing that Christians did do was keep many of their Jewish customs. So they, of course, kept the Old Testament, the scriptures. They kept similar worship styles to Jews, and they also kept the practice of baptism, which was originally a Jewish act. People would be baptized when they were sort of making a big change in their life or converting to Judaism. And so Christians kept this practice and made it really one of the central practices of the Christian faith. So I think we've covered most of that on this beginning part. Let's move on to the next slide. I don't want to tell you everything that's on this slide, but just this gives you an overview of the first 500 years of Christianity. And just note that, of course, the Roman Empire stretched all the way to almost 500. So the Romans were in charge during this whole time of early Christianity. The Christian persecutions, which varied from time to time happened during this first 300 years. And then various people throughout Christian history and also some councils are on this timeline. You don't actually need to know all of it. We're going to talk about Constantine, who's pretty important, very important in church history, and then we'll talk about later the division of the empire of East and West in the Roman Empire. So hopefully that's a little helpful just to give you an overview. Now to talk about persecution, it depended on who was emperor at the time, as to how bad persecution was of the Christians. So Nero was the first one under which Christian persecution took place. This was between 54 and 68 CE, and this persecution centered in Rome. There wasn't as much across the Roman Empire, but this was an important period because this is the time during which Paul, the Apostle Paul, and Peter were both executed. Now, the next time period is under the Emperor Domitian, and we talked about him, or you saw him in the Revelation video. He was emperor between 81 and 96, and there was a big deal about worshiping Domitian during this time period. Now, we don't know if he demanded that worship or if it was really all of his leaders that were trying to suck up to him, and they decided to, force people to worship him. We don't know for sure. But regardless, Christians were being forced to worship the emperor, and when Christians refused, they were persecuted. And so the time of Revelation was at this time. And so a lot of the imagery, the symbolic imagery from Revelation, comes out of the time when Domitian was emperor. The next big period of persecution was under Trajan. And when you were reading in your book, you probably saw there was a letter from Pliny the Younger, who was a leader, to the Emperor Trajan, asking him, hey, what do I do with these Christians that I've caught? Like, do you want me to persecute them? Do you want me to kill them? And so we get the idea that Trajan said, well, yeah, you need to punish them, but don't go looking for them. So we know then that there is a persecution taking place, but it wasn't the kind where, they would send people out to search for Christians. So that was during Trajan. And then you get intermittent persecution throughout the next couple of centuries under the Emperor Severus, under the Emperor Decius, and under the Emperor Valerian. I love seeing the name Severus because I'm a big Harry Potter fan. So Severus Snape there gets his name from this emperor. But probably the most severe persecution happened under Diocletian, which was way later in early Christianity, between 285 and 300. And this happened just a couple of decades before Christianity became a legal religion in the Roman Empire. So Diocletian is one to remember as well. So there were two categories of Christians in the first century that we're going to talk about. Now, there were just regular, everyday Christians, of course, but these are the people that we have records about. The martyrs, those people who gave up their lives for their Christian faith. They were killed, maybe in particular persecutions, or maybe they were brought into the arena in Rome and killed by lions, or maybe they were crucified. But there are many ways that people became martyrs in the first several centuries. And then the other group of people are the apologists, and these are Christian intellectuals, educated people who defended the Christian faith. They wrote many different treatises and books in order to defend the Christian faith to the Roman Empire, to say, hey, we're not so bad. You really don't need to be persecuting us. And so I'll highlight some of these martyrs. Ignatius of Antioch is one of the early ones. He was a bishop, and in the beginning of the second century, he wrote a whole bunch of letters to different churches, just like Paul had done. In fact, Ignatius's letters were being considered for the New Testament, but they were written a little late, and as you can see, he's kind of a fanatic is probably a strong word, but he's very eager to become a martyr, and I don't think the Christians wanted to put that kind of rhetoric into the New Testament. Then everybody would be rushing to try to die for God. So listen to some of his words. I am the wheat of God. Let me be ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I might be found the pure bread of Christ. So here you can see he's giving graphic descriptions of how he might die in the Roman arena. And it almost sounds like he wants it. And so Ignatius was pretty famous in the first century for this desire, this willingness to die. But he's also known for some of his wisdom. I love this quote from him: "Do not have Jesus Christ on your lips and the world in your heart." So even though he was a little enthusiastic, too enthusiastic for martyrdom, he had some very great things to say as well. And he becomes one of the earliest and most famous Christian martyrs. Now, there was a book written called The Martyrdom of Polycarp in the beginning of the 2nd century, and that's about Polycarp, who was another man who was a wise Christian who ended up dying. Now, he was not as eager to die as Ignatius. He hid for a little bit, and then once it seemed like he was going to be endangering other people, he turned himself in and he was martyred. And you can read about that in the document called The Martyrdom of Polycarp. Now, it was not just men that were martyred during these first centuries. There's this very interesting account called the Martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas. And this was a young woman who, beautiful young woman, a maiden who ends up going into the arena. And legend says, and this book says, that she basically said, bring on this persecution. I'm ready to die for my God. The lions come in, and legend says that they didn't want to touch her, that they laid down in front of her, and so they sent in a Roman soldier to come and kill her with his knife, and he couldn't do it, and so she grabs the knife and does it herself. And so it's very dramatic, and the whole, it shocks the whole arena. And these are instances in the first centuries that show the Roman emperor and empire how brave and how faithful Christians are. Now, was it something they wanted to encourage? Do you want to encourage people to, run to the arena and be willing to kill themselves? No. But you do see that their Christian faith is so important to them that they would be willing to die for it. And you should look it up. I would have played a video, but it was hard to hear. You should look up Saint Perpetua and just watch some things of her life. It's very fascinating. She was, I don't know what we would call a mystic. She prayed a lot, and she had visions from God, and that kind of gave her strength to defy the Roman Empire and to be willing to die for her faith. Now, this guy, Justin Martyr was not his last name. That's just the way that we refer to him. He was a martyr and an apologist. So he was an educated guy who wrote many things defending Christianity, but he also ended up dying by martyrdom in 165. So his most famous work is called Dialogue with Trypho. And basically he's having this conversation with a guy named Trypho and telling him all about Christianity. So he defends the Christian faith. And what he does is link Christian principles with philosophical principles. And so philosophy was very important in the Roman Empire, Greek and Roman philosophers. And Justin Martyr knew the philosophy very well. And so he ends up saying, hey, look, Christianity is just saying what this philosopher says. We're not this radical group that you should worry about. We actually have some beliefs that are very, very similar to the beliefs of philosophers. And so that actually helped Christianity spread among the more intellectual. And so he and other apologists in the first several centuries helped spread Christianity in a way that didn't necessarily involve mission work, traveling around, or martyrdom, making sure that you die for Christ in order to spread Christ's message. Though Justin did end up dying, not willingly necessarily, but because of what he wrote and who he was, he also was killed for his faith. We probably won't go on to this next one. In the next video, we're going to talk about the different strands of Christianity that were apparent in the first several centuries. But I will sign off for now.